Hi, everybody. I hope this week finds you well. The title of this week's lecture and content is Theories of Social Change. So just to sort of recap what we have talked about up to this point, we have looked at what it takes for social action to turn into social change and understanding that before any of that can happen, we need to have a clear definition of what the actual social issue or problem is and how it is created. So we've discussed basic causes of social problems and have looked at the epistemology of, or the etymology of social problems, especially as they relate to injustices and inequities, mostly deriving from all of the different isms that we think of and know of that play out in society. So racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, all of those isms that we're somewhat familiar with. And we've discussed who are the change agents, including the role of social workers as change agents in these social action efforts that ultimately result in social change around particular social issues and social problems. And we've talked about how the role of social workers as change agents is directly related to our charge as social workers and the mission of social work as a profession. And we've talked about the development of the practice of social work from both a micro and macro perspective, and how all of those different forms of practice work together in order to affect change. We've also talked a little bit about the types of social action, including preventative measures, which are efforts to try to ensure that something doesn't happen or doesn't happen again, something that has been perceived to be a social problem. We've talked about some curative approaches, which would be efforts that have been put in place to try to cure or eliminate or fix, quote unquote, some type of social problem. And we've talked about efforts kind of in between those two approaches, alleviative care, which are efforts that basically minimize the effects of a social problem or the implications of it, doesn't prevent it because it's too late to prevent, but it doesn't cure it or make it go away. It basically is more like putting a bandage on it and helping it feel a little bit better and not be quite as consequential. That is an alleviative approach. And we talked a little bit about punitive approaches, which are efforts of deterrent, basically. Things that might be put in place to try to prevent or minimize issues, but really kind of trying to deter them. And if a deterrence isn't possible, then there would be some kind of blame or some kind of negative consequence put into place in order to punish someone or scapegoat them potentially. We also have talked about the different types of social action, including alternative, redemptive, reformative, and revolutionary or transformative types of social action. And we've talked about some of the stages of social movements in particular, as seen in the examples of Black Lives Matter and Occupy Wall Street. Next, we're going to talk about different theories of social change and look at some examples of what works and what doesn't work, and maybe a little bit of why things don't work, especially as it relates to looking at power and privilege and looking at issues related to systemic racism. So that's where we're going to go next. Basically, we are looking at two overarching models of change, social change in particular, and these are very basic to social action and what we know about the makeup of social change efforts. So one of the main models of change is addressed as women-centered change models, and just some examples that you may be somewhat familiar with. Things like the settlement house movement, which is basically a social work approach, right? We've talked about this already. The settlement house movement is one example of a woman-centered change model approach, as is the historic African American Women's Home Place and Black Women's Club. And a little bit more modern of an example that you might be familiar with is MAD, the Mothers Against Drunk Driving campaign. And so within the women-centered model of organizing for community change, the idea is that it takes let me restart that sentence. A women-centered model of organizing takes this sense of caring and nurturing of people, generally seen in the private sphere, and expands it to the public sphere, with women becoming like activist mothers, so to speak. That's a quote from your readings. And these women who are concerned not just for children, but with all the children in the community, it really takes on this notion of it takes a village. So that the connotation of that phrase is kind of a collectivist view. If we work together, it's everyone's responsibility, to make things better for everyone in the community. In this case, specifically talking about children. But the settlement house movement was all about, women being the leaders and organizing communities, not just for the sake of children, but refugees and immigrants and people of color and low-income folks and families and individuals that were really in some dire straits, and mostly because of systemic issues or external and macro challenges that were preventing them from sort of getting ahead and getting all their needs met. And so really it was this idea of it takes a village for all of us to be happy and healthy and to be able to fulfill the American dream and to live a life of prosperity and so on and so forth. So this was really a model of women-centered change efforts that manifested in these different kinds of movements. So basically, with women-centered models of change and this idea of, it takes a village and kind of everybody working together collectively for change, this connection to others leads to a value system that focuses on the community rather than individual self-interest. It also focused on the process of empowerment as the key to community organizing rather than building power, with relationships being the key to sustain the struggle over time. So it's important to remember that this ethic of care is not necessarily biologically derived as women's natural role, quote unquote. This is coming from your readings for this week too, but rather it is socially constructed from American norms and values that have promoted women taking care of the family. So those normalized gender roles that have been socially constructed in the United States. So the goal is to bring people together to resolve conflict and build community. And this work, like, notorious for Settlement House movement efforts, has always been done in small groups and is highly relational, where trust and rapport can be built and listening can take place. Women-centered organizing provides a safe space for community members to grow and develop, and it emphasizes the importance of building a safe space where they develop the belief that it's possible to work for the betterment of others and themselves, rather than initially focusing on changing policies or institutional structures. In a women-centered organizing model, the people that organize and the people that lead are many times the same folks. And so this model focuses on encouraging the development of many leaders and is not about just developing a single leader for the cause. So it really is based on empowerment of a group of people. Now, similarly, but a little bit different, the ideas around African American women's home place efforts and later Black women's clubs and other more contemporary examples, these were women-centered movements of change that really emphasized having a space for humanization. So the African American women's home places started with slaves, right? And so the idea behind this was that home is your sanctuary, that is your safe place, regardless of how you're treated or talked about or talked to, or regardless of what happens to you outside of your family and your home space is a space to feel dignity, love, and respect and worth, and it's a space to nurture one's spirits. So the home place idea was a site of resistance to white supremacy and contained a radical political element, surprisingly, because it promoted many of the components of a woman-centered model of organizing, including that group-centered leadership and facilitation. It was also consensus decision-making driven, and there was a strong belief that the marginalized must be directly involved in the planning of direct actions. However, it again was very home-based, so the sense of empowerment was being provided from the family and from the cultural community that people identified with, and that's where their sense of strength and esteem and empowerment stemmed from, not relying on external connections. So the second major model of community change and social action efforts is based on the methods of Saul Alinsky. And Saul Alinsky is kind of considered to be the father of community organizing in the United States. And his model is based in sort of an aggressive and confrontational stance in the public sphere, where community members build an organization in order to achieve their needs through direct action. So he was kind of considered a radical. As a matter of fact, he wrote a book called Rules for Radicals, although really his message was more about not giving up and fighting for what is right and just, and being persistent and trying whatever it takes in order to persuade for change. Now, some people didn't always like his approaches because maybe they thought they were a little bit too conflictual, but in the end, his power techniques and tactics were very successful in a lot of situations. This model assumes that humans are primarily self-interested, so the most effective way to get people involved in social action is to appeal to their self-interest. So this is kind of where the idea of what's in it for me comes from. So in contrast to women-centered models of change that were kind of collectivist and let's work together, we don't need one single leader, we can all do this together. His approach, Alinsky's approach, was really taking that independent framework, if you will, and using it to the advantage of a broader community and saying what's in it for me, but then knowing that what's in it for one person will likely draw other people in for the same cause. So for Alinsky, power was considered a zero-sum game, but at the same time, he believed that the system is open to everyone. Therefore, the marginalized must engage as equals with the political and economic elite, and they must take power away from these groups by putting pressure on these elites through public demonstrations and activities that cannot be easily ignored. That was a direct quote from your readings as well. So for Alinsky, the goal was to win victories by being in conflict with a target. So his approach is basically there is a winner, there is a loser. And so if you think about it, that really stems from a conflict theory where people are in conflict over scarce resources, and in order to get what you need, you have to put up a fight and stand up for yourself. So he is known for advocating for some confrontational rhetoric, which led to, kind of the idea of winners and losers. And he also actively organized communities in order to engage in small-scale conflict against the people that hold power, and whether it was like a businessman or a realtor or a mayor or something like that. And he really viewed that the political and economic system did not necessarily need to be changed in and of themselves, but rather the marginalized needed to develop power so they could operate in the political sphere to get their fair share. So if they could just penetrate those guards or those systemic barriers that were put in place and get around them, then they could play the game along with everyone else on a fair playing field. Alinsky's model, in contrast to the women-centered models of change, has really been considered to be a masculine view, and kind of how that's perpetuated in social norms, if you will, because it has been seen as competitive and conflictual, which are oftentimes traits that are given to men in this society. And he really placated the people who had power and advantage, or one of the quotes he is known for is saying, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. And he believed that the marginalized can achieve their demands by focusing on an individual rather than an institution, and this achieved by isolating the target from other people in power and by emphasizing that the target is the problem. So if you can eliminate the target being the problem, then you can make way for changes in power and therefore getting your demands met, getting what you need, in other words. Now, Alinsky's model does promote having specific spokespeople or leaders that speak on behalf of a group, a social activist group. And Alinsky is known for coming up with, I want to say 12 or 13, looks like 13 sort of rules, I guess, for activists. And you can learn more about these rules for radicals, not only in his book by the same title, but by watching the YouTube clip that I have linked in this PowerPoint. You may have to type it into your own URL, or your own browser, put that in the URL space in your browser to watch it. It is also posted on our Canvas site, I believe. It's kind of medium in length. I think it's about 25 minutes. It's not mandatory that you watch it, but it's there for your information in case you do want to know more about the Alinsky model, which has influenced a lot of community organizing and social action movements in our country. As a matter of fact, President Obama once held the same position that Saul Alinsky had in Chicago, and President Obama's preceptors, while he was doing community organizing work in the Chicago area, were literally students of Saul Alinsky, a generation before President Obama. So kind of an interesting connection there if you want to delve into that more. But just in a nutshell, the rules for radicals in Alinsky's terms are: 1, power is not only what you have, but what the enemy thinks you have. Power is derived from 2 main sources, money and people, the haves and the have-nots. The have-nots must build power from flesh and blood. 2, never go outside the expertise of your people. It results in confusion, fear, and retreat. Feeling secure adds to the backbone of anyone. 3, whenever possible, go outside the expertise of the enemy. Look for ways to increase insecurity, anxiety, and uncertainty. 4, make the enemy live up to its own book of rules. If the rule is that every letter gets a reply, send 30,000 letters. You can kill them with this because no one can possibly obey all of their own rules. 5, ridicule is man's most potent weapon. There is no defense. It's irrational. It's infuriating. It also works as a key pressure point to force the enemy into concessions. 6, a good tactic is one your people enjoy. They'll keep doing it without urging and come back to do more. They're doing their thing and will even suggest better ones. 7, a tactic that drags on too long becomes a drag. Don't become old news. 8, keep the pressure on. Never let up. Keep trying new things to keep the opposition off balance. As the opposition masters one approach, hit them from the flank with something new. 9, the threat is usually more terrifying than the thing itself. Imagination and ego can dream up many more consequences than any activist. 10, the major premise for tactics is the development of operations that will maintain a constant pressure upon the opposition. It is this unceasing pressure that results in the reactions from the opposition that are essential for the success of the campaign. 11, if you push a negative hard enough, it will push through and become a positive. Violence from the other side can win the public to your side because the public sympathizes with the underdog. 12, the price of a successful attack is a constructive alternative. Never let the enemy score points because you're caught without a solution to the problem. And 13, pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. cut off the support network, and isolate the target from sympathy. Go after people and not institutions. People hurt faster than institutions. So when you think about those rules for radicals in accordance with Saul Alinsky's model of change, think about how that might connect to things that you're seeing happen today, whether it's Black Lives Matter movement, whether it's the Me Too movement, whether it's, something to do with combating police brutality, whether it has anything to do with how to handle a global public health pandemic, any social issue. When you hear these rules that he's established, you are probably able to find some connection to with the different social actions being introduced to address those issues and try to affect change. From one side or another of the parties involved, you likely see some of these tactics happening or being implemented. So something to kind of consider as you read more or watch more about those efforts. I feel like it is very much in line with a motto you may often hear me talk about, which is persistence and patience pay off. You don't give up. You keep at it, little by little, step by step, plugging away and not giving up. Sometimes you have to approach things and reapproach them from different angles and using different means to achieve the ends that you're striving for. But you don't give in to the powers that be if you are committed to a cause. And that is essentially what Saul Alinsky's model of change is all about. So those are the two major theories of change, or the overarching dominant change models for social action that most efforts are somehow tied to, that we have seen throughout time in the United States. So now, regardless of what the underlying theories might be, what we see happening in different nonprofit organizations or community organizing efforts or social action movements or some other kind of entity is that in order to cultivate innovation, in order to create a social action that can be successful, we have to build the people power for innovation through leaders and teams and meaningful partners. We need to cultivate the right skills and tools for innovation and galvanize thinking that allows creativity to flourish and innovation to emerge. We have to find ways to think outside of the box and to be creative and to be brave enough to do trial and error with our actions. We have to be able to think in a way where we have a plan A and a plan B and a plan C and be ready to try something different if our first efforts aren't as successful as we want them to be. So, in order to create the right conditions for this kind of innovation, this slide here kind of bullet points all of the important factors that need to be taken into consideration, right? So you need the right people, which include leaders for change, whether it's individuals or multiple spokespeople. We need powerful teams. We need meaningful partners, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But we need tools. We need the ways to communicate effectively and design thinking strategies and to know how to use technology. And the third thing we need is a mindset. And we might have a beginner's mindset, and we need to have a social commitment. We have to have some level of empathy and tolerance for failure and to be planful. So in looking at the people that we need in order to ensure that the conditions for change are right, we need to look at the types of leaders that we engage with. And these are people who have similar characteristics, like, for example, a vision for the future, and they have attention that they pay to the possible context of tomorrow. They don't dwell on the past, they're forward thinking. They have shared leadership styles that motivate and support other people. They are preceptors and they're inspirational. They are, ambitious and can engage people and elicit a following because of their leadership styles. They have the capacity to lead by example with their own innovation efforts. They're not afraid to do what they ask others to do. They are strong role models and preceptors, and again, think outside the box. They have the ability to catalyze action and leverage collective work and harness individual creativity. They've got charisma. They can bring people together, and they have a way of mobilizing efforts and getting people on board and ready to take action. They have a willingness to provide the necessary resources and attention for experimentation and new ideas. So like I talked about, being ready with multiple plans of action in case one thing doesn't work out, having a positive attitude towards trial and error. They also have a steadfast commitment to communicating about innovation and its centrality to an organization's mission or the mission of a cause. They have the characteristic of being able to support creativity and risk-taking and experimentation. They have the ability to accept those who challenge the status quo and traditional processes. They have a way of accepting and embracing people that are not afraid to rock the boat. They have the ability to evaluate new initiatives and use failures as learning opportunities. They have commitment to and talent with regard to engaging key stakeholders and their boards. And in order to create powerful teams, they organize in a purposeful way that creates innovation, and they capture the diversity of talent among people and entities that can serve the cause well. They recognize power of including, even people or resources or assets that are easily overlooked. They give real power and autonomy to teams to support action and decision making. They prepare teams so they have the skills and knowledge and competencies needed in order to be successful. They engage teams in different aspects of innovation, from idea development and implementation of those ideas to sustaining successfulness. They recognize that different teams are needed for different purposes, so they can designate and kind of divide and conquer. And they have the ability to meaningfully stimulate and leverage team creativity. Making or creating the right conditions for social action and social change through innovation also includes harnessing meaningful partners. So leveraging relationships for successful innovation includes having the ability to establish relationships with a very diverse set of partners who share similar perspectives or have complementary skills. It's engaging partnerships across the private and public, the for-profit and nonprofit sectors, kind of having bringing people together using a collective impact model to some extent so that everyone is engaged and can work together to accomplish the same goal. They have the ability to consider partnerships that are focused on specific projects and longer term relationships. So it's not just about meeting the goal, it's about sustaining it and moving forward from once you accomplish one goal, what's the next goal that you're going to accomplish together? And then where do you go from there? What are the next steps? So constantly having that forward thinking of what's next. It's also about reflecting on how partnerships serve each other and the cause, and including community groups or alliances or other, collaborative partnerships as potential assets and resources. It's about identifying problems and solutions with the community rather than for the community. So those are all of the important ways to create those right conditions for change around your people power, okay? Developing leaders for change, developing powerful teams, and developing meaningful partnerships. That's the part about organizing your people power. The next part of creating or cultivating the right conditions for change has to do with the tools available to you as organizers or social action or social movement activists. So you need to be able to organize your necessary tools for innovation by cultivating multiple communication tools that allow conversations across language, culture, and ability. You have to be able to communicate with people where they're at their level, and nurturing creativity by using all forms of communication, not just verbal or oral or written language, but using the arts and using media and technology. Those are very effective tools of communication. Using the basics of design thinking and applying it to an environment. Integrating technology into the process also stimulates new ways of thinking and helping people to think outside the box, and opens the potential for new solutions and new innovative ideas. It encourages people to have open minds and use social interactions as the driver for success. It's a way to capitalize on the power of technology as a tool to measure social impact and promote empathy. Using your tools effectively in order to create social change and innovative action has a lot to do with experimentation. Again, that idea of trial and error and not being afraid to take those risks. So it's about purpose and purposefully creating time and space and structures for innovation. So those are some of the ways to cultivate the right conditions for change using your tools within your social action group. And lastly, cultivating the right conditions for change and social action has to do with the idea that innovation requires not only the tools and the people, but also changing paradigms. So developing an organized social action or community organizing effort of some kind that's ready to engage in innovative work involves preparing people to think like innovators. So you got to help people have or come to a point of adapting a mindset that aligns with practice and purpose. So thinking like an innovator keeps the mind open to creativity and available to new ideas, And it has to do with humility and being open to different solutions and learning from different experiences. So having a beginner's mindset is a positive thing because it allows people, you know, the ability to accept failure if and when it comes, and to learn from it and use it to their advantage to move forward with their cause and their social action efforts. It's also imperative to consider social commitment, and in considering social innovation success, it becomes imperative to embed the social in all that we do. So that was something from your readings as well. It talks about the importance of social ties and relationships, and some definitions of social innovation include new social relationships as a necessary component, while others acknowledge the tremendous potential of within and cross-sector partnerships for doing transformative work. So basically what that is meaning is that social reminds us of the reason for innovation work undertaken at any given point in time. It refers to the goals to ameliorate social problems and enhance social justice. So equity in communities and enhancing the lives of others remains, you know, the end goal, right? And anything else becomes insignificant, and we need to be perseverant and keep our eyes on the goal at all times. So in order to be successful with our social commitments, we have to start with empathy. And empathy is a critical element for building reciprocal partnerships and authentic solidarity with and among marginalized groups of people. So being aware of other perspectives and trying to understand the world through a different lens helps us understand the human condition, making us better able to solve complex problems. So having the capacity for empathy allows you to leave behind preconceived notions and stereotypes that often get in the way of moving forward or making changes or understanding other people, and really understanding the true experience of people impacted by the causes that we're fighting for. Empathy allows us to more deeply understand the problems we seek to address and create solutions that will be more readily accepted by those in need. And again, I know I've said this more than once already, but the mindset in preparing for the right conditions for social change and innovation is also about the tolerance for failure, the experimentation, the trial and error of things, and accepting failure and learning from it. This is a key component of an innovation mindset. And lastly, as part of the mindset, the innovation mindset, and preparing for change, we need to talk about planning. It's about planning with purpose and learning from mistakes. In innovation, we purposely and purposefully integrate the steps of the process with our future work. We don't give up. We don't just let things happen by chance. We don't wait for things to occur. We take action planfully and purposefully and mindfully. We mindfully create opportunities and spaces for change to occur. So to think like an innovator means paying attention to and creating those opportunities. It means growing and being flexible and developing our skill set, and utilizing our resources and assets that we're surrounded with. And it's about embedding innovation and creativity into practices and processes that are being cultivated and implemented in our social action efforts. So, all of that said, which was quite a mouthful of explanations, this slide shows you some examples of change models and paradigm shifts that stem from some of these innovation and social action theories or approaches to social change. And for more information, you can copy and paste these URL addresses into a browser, or I think all of these are actually posted on our Canvas site for this week as well. You can learn a little bit more about these. Now, these are examples of changing industries, if you will, that are still in progress. And so from a theoretical perspective, it makes sense that they should be effective and be beneficial to the target of the change. Although I would actually caution you in that the jury might be out, so to speak, on the full outcomes of some of these change efforts. So one example is the culture change in long-term care. This is specifically around changing models of care in nursing homes or long-term care facilities for older adults. So historically, long-term care in all of its forms has really been based on a medical model, which has been very institutionalized in nature and implemented in kind of a top-down approach where the doctors and nurses kind of dictate how things happen and how people's lives are structured and organized and lived, and make the decisions as to what's in the best interest of the people that they're serving, namely older adults in need of long-term care. Well, that model has been criticized over the years, and there has been a huge movement, a culture change movement in the industry to develop a more person-centered care for older adults in long-term care settings. And the idea is really to kind of reverse the historical way in which older people in need have been treated. And rather than having decisions made from the top down, the decisions are made from the bottom up. And it has been more socially integrated, or rather based on more of a social care model rather than a medical model. So just to give you some examples of what that means or how that manifests is that instead of, administrators, for example, creating a schedule for the staff create their own schedules in collaboration with each other and understanding the needs and the preferences of the people that they're providing care for. And part of that includes that the older adults themselves have a voice and a say in their daily needs being met, their daily care. So they get to decide when and what day they want to take a bath, for example. They get to decide what time they go to bed or what time they wake up. They get to decide how they spend their time during the day, what activities they're involved in or not, rather than being told what to do, basically. The social connection part also has a lot to do with engaging with intergenerational opportunities. So being around younger people, especially children, being around animals or plants. And so when you see the integration of gardens or animals or pets or children into long-term care environments, it's really part of this culture change model in long-term care and helping people connect to other things in the social environment beyond just their medical situation. And it allows for them to create a different sense of self and perceptions of quality of life that are not focused on their health care or their medical status or limitations. And so it really is a different way of thinking about how to care for older people, how to improve the quality of care provided to them, and ultimately how to best maximize their quality of life. Another example of paradigm shifts is this idea of converting from a medical care model to social model for people with disabilities. So the idea of building infrastructures within our natural communities, our social communities, in order to allow people with disabilities to live amongst the community and be fully integrated with the same kinds of access and opportunities that people without disabilities enjoy, and finding ways to allow them to maximize, again, their quality of life, and by being fully integrated into the community. This video clip is relatively short, and I think you'll really like it. It's a very good depiction of how to reverse our thinking about creating environments that allow people with disabilities equal access and equal opportunity in the natural world. So I encourage you to check that one out in particular. Another model of change that really is a paradigm shift that you might be familiar with is the concept of deinstitutionalization, particularly for people with mental illness, as opposed to the historical institutionalization of care that people with mental illnesses have experienced, which unfortunately have a negative connotation to them. When you think of how people were treated, or rather mistreated, often in congregate housing institutionalized settings where, like a mental asylum or a training school for people with mental illnesses, this was kind of the standard of care not that long ago for people with mental illnesses, when we didn't have as good of an understanding of brain disorders as maybe we do today. But the historical practice of institutionalization was very limiting for people with mental illnesses and did not allow for maximized quality of life or equal opportunities or any opportunities for any sense of recovery, and were very distinct settings that were not conducive to treating people very well. And the idea of deinstitutionalization was to help get people with mental illnesses out of institutions and into the community, very similar to the social model of care for people with disabilities as well. But getting them into the community and building infrastructure within our natural societies that can support people outside of an institution and integrate them effectively into the community so they can fairly and equitably live amongst the natural community among people that do not have mental illnesses as well. And the idea behind that is, again, to maximize people's quality of life and to put people on more of a level playing field with equal opportunities and access. Another notion that you might be familiar with that also includes a paradigm shift or a change model in a specific industry is looking at the way in which people who have a substance abuse addiction may be supported or treated. So there's kind of this movement, if you will, to change the way in which we affect change for people with addictions, rather than punishing them and imprisoning them and treating them like criminals. The idea is to provide them treatment and rehabilitation for their addiction, and to understand that the addiction is more akin to a disease and has physiological components that can be addressed from more of a medical and social model, not a punitive model. Punishing someone or blaming them or criminalizing their addictions does not effectively help somebody recover from the physiological and psychological addictions of substances. So there has been major efforts to provide more community-based rehabilitation and treatment for people with addictions, rather than promoting punitive imprisonment for people with addictions. So those are just some examples of paradigm shifts or social change models that are in effect as we speak and are being pushed through. Now on Canvas, there are also some examples of things. I don't have them on the slide here, but if you look on Canvas, there's some examples that you can get more information on, for example, regarding Head Start programs. And so Head Start program was in and of itself a paradigm shift in the fact that it was created in order to help low income and disadvantaged young children, preschool age, to give them a head start if they came from a disadvantaged background, get them ready for kindergarten, and so they could start elementary school at the same level as their peers who were not coming from backgrounds of disadvantage or low income or whatever. Now, the research has shown that actually our Head Start programs don't work. The way they were originally designed has not benefited, and we have had this model in place for decades, since the middle of the 1960s, and it was perpetually funded by the federal government with this idea that it should work. And a lot of research has been done in the past 20 years or so that actually showed the method does not have long-term effects, even though we may have seen some minor changes in the short term that were beneficial. Now they're revamping those efforts and kind of trying to change some things, but it's based on the idea that what we had in place, what we thought was going to be this great idea, after 40 years of implementing it and seeing no long-term results, we have to do something different. Okay, another example that is posted on Canvas is the DARE program, the Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program. Many of you probably experienced that when you were in elementary school. The main goal was to deter people from, experimenting with drugs or alcohol and preventing all of the complications that come from that down the road. So it was an early intervention model trying to prevent something bad from happening before it started. And again, the evidence showed after many years of funding that program, as much as 75% of elementary schools across the United States implemented the DARE program. And just in the past decade, they have determined that it was not worth it, even though billions of dollars had went into it, and it was not shown to be effective. And they have since revamped that program and are trying to implement a variation of it to see if they can have better outcomes around preventing drug and alcohol abuse, as well as gang violence and community violence and the like. And there's another example on Canvas too around abstinence-only sex education programs and how ineffective those efforts have been made, or have been, despite all of the money that has gone into them, into our public school systems. And so just understanding that some innovations or efforts that have been thought to be innovative and have had a lot of social action around them don't always work the way that people think they will. And so it kind of just goes into that idea that we have to be prepared to try new things and to not get stuck in a rut just because we think it sounds good or that theoretically it should work, but we have to base our decisions on the facts and evidence and, you know, have the right information to make good decisions about what to do next and how best to make change in the areas that we care about and the problems that we see in as being worthy of social action in our societies.